Thanks, Julie.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to AFP's webinar. Our main topic of today is salary sacrifice deployment, but we will, as promised, touch on tax at year-end hints and hopefully give you some tips. I'm delighted to introduce myself, Julie Summerall. I'm an AFP director and your host for today, along with my colleague, James Pestle, who's also an AFP director. Our presenters for today are John Burdekin, Fleet Consultant, and Harvey Perkins from HRUX. As you can see, we've got a full agenda this morning. We'll try and keep to the times because I know you're all very busy people. Before we begin the presentation, I'd like to advise that we'll be recording the webinar to allow members to review content at a later stage. And we're having a Q&A session, as the agenda says, with the panel, and Paul Hollick will be joining us for that. But obviously, feel free to place any questions in the Q&A chat box. I'd like to hand over to I'd like to hand over to John first to Harvey first for our first of today's presentations. Thank you, Harvey.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning, everybody. John and I are going to talk primarily about green car salary sacrifice. And the way we've decided to split that is I'm going to talk to you about what it is and why it works mathematically. And then John is going to talk a little bit about what you need to do to implement one of these arrangements, because I think it's fair to say that this is quite a straightforward thing to do. But there are traps in it to catch the unwary. So like so many things in life where tax is concerned, the devil is in the detail. So without further ado, I'm just going to walk you through some high-level slides explaining the background to company cars, talking about what a salary sacrifice is. And I've said there the tasks, but that's the bit that John is going to pick up. So background to company cars. An overview of company cars and how tax is applied. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So basically, I'm sure I'm teaching my grandmother the suck eggs here, but the way in which you calculate a tax charge on a company car is you take its list price as published and you multiply it by a percentage. And we've been doing this since 1992. The government tell us what the percentage is, and they've had a couple of cracks at different ways of working out what that should be. And the rule is now based upon the CO2 emissions of the vehicle. So if we go to the next table, those are the rates for 2021, 21, 22, and 22, 23. So if a car emits no CO2 at all, then the scale charge is 1% currently, and from April, it will be 2%. What we're saying is if a car costs £100,000 for the sake of argument, you multiply that by 2%, which gives you £2,000, and that £2,000 is treated as income of the employee for tax purposes and employer's NIC purposes. And that is a very, very small amount compared to historical rates between 15 and 35%. If the car is a plug-in electric hybrid, you have to look to its electric-only range, and we'll talk about that in a minute because that number could be quite hard to get to, particularly if you're filling in P11Ds, as I'm sure many of you will be aware. But basically, if your electric-only range is less than 30, then the tax charge from April will be 14%. 30 to 39 is 12, 40 to 69 is 8, 70 to 129 is 5. I think we now have cars in that 70 to 129 range where the rate would be 5. If we had anything that would do more than 130 miles, like for instance, a range extender, then you potentially could have a charge on a FEV of just 2%. But again, I don't believe any of those exists unless John knows any better. What does that actually mean? Well, if we go to the next slide, and just pop all of those graphs up. So I know some of you will have seen this slide before because I use it a lot. And Paul keeps asking me to use a range of cars and not just Skodas, but I'm lazy, so it still has Skodas everywhere. But basically the two red cars are diesels. So if you've got a diesel Skoda Superb Estate 2 litre, which I think everyone will agree up until a couple of years ago was like de facto company car territory. Well, the tax charge for a 40% taxpayer will be £4,557. That's the tax, just the tax that the employee would pay in a year, and only £400 a month, which I think everyone will agree is wow. On an Octavia, lower CO2, lower list price, it's 3,331, still way, way too high. Toyota Prius, which is a self-charging hybrid, and I won't get into the word self-charging because there's some debate about that, but basically it doesn't come with a 3-pin plug. You can't plug it into the mains. Doesn't really get the big tax breaks that PHEVs and electrics get. So the charge would still be 2,565. However, if you get into plug-in electric hybrids and the Skoda Superb and the Skoda Octavia electric hybrid, you get down to 1,812 and 1,094. Now, these are pretty good tax rates for cars historically. They only look bad because we have this really, really low rate, lowest in several generations for EVs. So on an Enyaq, the rate there is for 323 for the higher range version and 272 for the lower range version. I often say to people, £272, you literally will spend more money in Starbucks or Costa, depending on your preference, and other coffee shops are of course available, than you will on company car tax. So you have a situation that the tax charge on a company car, if it's the right company car, is at an all-time low. Just to answer the question I've just seen pop up there, yeah, these rates are confirmed for EVs anyway until April 2025. After that, all bets are off. We don't really know what will happen after April 2025. Although when we have debated it, I think the sense we have is they won't go up dramatically very quickly. So 26, they might be a little bit higher, 27, a bit higher again. As we get towards the end of the decade, though, I think all observers think that the tax rate for EVs will go up. We just have no idea by how much. So we go to the next slide. If the tax on the car is low and the tax on your salary is high, can we swap one for another? Because that's what we're talking about here. Can we just not have one thing and have something else? So let's just look at what salary sacrifice is. Sorry, next slide. The employee gives up their contractual entitlement to part of their salary in return for something else. So this is really, really important. From an HMRC perspective, this is really, really important. It's not a deduction from pay. It's you giving up your contractual entitlement to something for a significant period of time. So in this case, it would be the contract period for the car. You sign a change to your terms and conditions of employment so that you are paid less. And in return, you get a benefit, and the benefit is a car. Where you make a valid sacrifice, the gross amount sacrifice reduces income tax and NI for the employee and in NI for the employer. It currently only works if the car emits 75 grams or less of CO2 from the tailpipe. Everyone thinks they'll move that to 50 grams at some point, but they haven't done it yet. The point is, and I'll show you this later, mathematically, it only really works very well for an EV. You'd still have to pay quite a lot of company car tax for a plug-in electric hybrid. So really, this scheme is very, very good for EVs, and it's okay for PHEVs. Most of my clients are only implementing for EV because, of course, that's where they want to be from an environmental perspective. And you can sacrifice for the full cost of the car, which is what we're talking about today, but you could also sacrifice for a contribution. So you see situations where employees are asked to pay a sacrifice contribution in order to get an EV where they've been maybe in a diesel Octavia. So there's a significant difference in the rental between the car they're coming out of and the car they're coming into, and they're asked to pay the difference as a contribution, but that's treated itself as a salary sacrifice. Next slide, please. So how does that work? Well, from an employer's perspective, you work out what the car is going to cost the employer to provide as a company car. It's a company car, the employer is on the hook to pay for it. So you work out what that will be, and you include in that not only everything you know about, but other things that might happen. So that will be rental, that will be SMR, that will be insurance, because obviously you have to insure the car, but it might also be things like early termination insurance, insurance against long-term sick and maternity. There might be an admin charge or a provision. And the gross amount of the salary sacrifice, whatever that adds up for that particular vehicle, in this case, for this Mercedes EQC, £13,000, is the amount that the employee is then asked to sacrifice. So in effect, the employee is paying for the vehicle. They're not, you're paying for the vehicle, but they're giving up something of equal value. They're giving up their entitlement to 13,000 of salary. So it's a wash. And from your perspective, the car costs you nothing as long as things go to plan. And in fact, it's better than that because the employer on the gross sacrifice will also save national insurance. And in this case, that's just under £2,000 a year. So that's quite a lot of money. And the employee has an amount to pay, which is 668. So that's the gross sacrifice, the 13,203, less tax, less national insurance, divide by 12 gives you 668 a month for comparison to other ways of funding vehicles. To give you an idea of what that looks like on some sample cars, if we go to the next slide. So I know this looks complicated. I mean, it's almost as colorful as John's wallpaper. But basically what you've got here is just 3 cars at 3 different tax rates. So you've got a Mini Cooper, a Polestar 2 and a Porsche Taycan. And at 20% in the green section, which is the first 3 columns, what we're saying is if you were to go out and lease that car privately, so that's the Mini Cooper, that would cost you $545. That's the cost of the vehicle plus insurance plus SMR would be about $545 a month. If you were to take a gross salary sacrifice for that as an employee, it would be $511. You would save tax and national insurance of $170. You would pay company car tax, but it's only £9 a month, and that would give you a total cost of $350. So £350 a month is the true cost of that Mini Cooper. All you'd have to do on top of that is pay for electricity, and even that is covered in some of the arrangements. And that would leave you with a monthly saving from salary sacrifice of $195. $268 on the Polestar, $465 on the Porsche. But the point to this is that you are saving tax and national insurance. So the more tax and national insurance you pay, the more you save. So same cars, you see the personal lease cost is the same all the way across the top, $545 for the Mini Cooper in all 3 tax bands, but the tax savings are greater. So the Mini Cooper for a 40% taxpayer is £309 a month, the Polestar $432, the Taycan $742. If you have an employee or a director who's in this sort of magical range, although it's black magic, between 100 and 125,000 of total earnings, you basically have a tax rate of 60%. You won't find that in any tax table, but the way it works is that once you reach 100,000, you start losing your personal allowances, and you lose them at 50p in the pound until they've all gone. So between 100 and 125,000 pounds, you are effectively paying tax at 60%. Not a lot of people know that. And that means that on the Mini Cooper, it would only cost you 216 quid. And yes, you can have a Porsche Taycan for £521 a month. Although I don't believe they're making them at the moment. But if they were, you can have a Porsche Taycan for £521 a month. So this is incredibly attractive. It is the most attractive employee benefit that we've seen for a long time, because the tax and national insurance savings are just so substantial. And in fact, you're allowing your employee to lease a vehicle through their gross pay and generate these significant tax and national insurance savings. Next slide, please. In summary, and I know that, that John will cover some of this as well, but you provide an employee with a brand new, fully maintained and fully insured vehicle. The average car in the UK is 8.6 years old. So if you think about your grey fleet, employees opting out of that and into this and moving into a brand new, potentially Euro NCAP 5-star vehicle, which is going to be safe, it's going to be maintained, it's going to be insured. So that's great. The employees can achieve tax savings, the employers can achieve tax savings. There is the potential to pass the NIC saving back to the employee. So the employers to that £2,000 on the EQC could get that back to the employee. Just so you know, that it was £668 a month for the employee on that Mercedes EQC, and the employer was saving £2,000. If the employer elected to not make a saving and to pass that saving back, then the cost of the vehicle would fall from £668 to £586 a month. So that's quite a substantial additional benefit for the employee. I'd say most of my clients are sharing the NIC savings, but by no means all. Obviously much cheaper for an EV than a personal lease. It's important to understand that employer cost. John will talk a lot about this, but not just the costs that we know about, but the costs we don't know about. Employee orders a vehicle and then leaves. What happens then? Big issue that everyone wants to know the answer to. And obviously it's helping us all into newer, greener vehicles, which Boris Johnson says is what we should do. You do need to watch out for the pitfalls. National minimum wage is one, and early terminations, excess mileage charges, all that sort of thing. But again, I'm stealing John's thunder, so I'll shut up. Next slide, please. So the tasks is something which John is really going to talk about, but I do want to make one observation, please. So if we go to the next slide. Leasing companies lease cars. We've been doing it since the 1950s. They're very, very good at it. They're very large, well-funded organizations, and they know what they're doing for the most part. And that's really all that's happening here, is you're leasing a car for an employee. You can purchase them. I do have clients who purchase their cars, but most will be leased. So in that box, number 2, really a leasing company is just doing what a leasing company does. And they should just be encouraged to do that and do that well. The complexity, therefore, really lies in box 1, which is more of an internal HR issue for you. So it's about determining the employee's budget and managing the associated communication and administration. So that's things like, for instance, making sure employees sign those declarations, those changes to terms and conditions, accept and sign the new scheme rules associated with a company car. And then you have to manage payroll, which is easy to say, but as I've said repeatedly, the devil's in the detail. So there's a role for you in determining how this is going to work. And then there's a role for a leasing company in going out and getting a car and delivering it and making sure it works and that it's defleeted at the end. And the art, therefore, is bringing those 2 things together and making it work for you as employer. Next slide, please. So that's the bit on salary sacrifice. I know that was very rapid, but hopefully it makes a lot of sense, or some sense, or any sense. And obviously we can answer questions towards the end. I've also been asked to just touch upon year end, because we're approaching the end of the tax year in the UK. And I don't have a lot of time to do this, but I just wanted to cover a couple of quick points for you. And then again, we can answer questions at the end. So the big issue tends to be P11D. And for you, it tends to be about the data you get from your suppliers that you need in order to complete P11Ds. And you'll be thinking about where that data is going to come from, and you'll be thinking about the quality of the data and the validation of that data. We've had good and bad experience with data that we've been provided by lease providers. In particular, we had 2 major issues last year, and the indication is that it will be better this year, but by no means perfect. The first was about establishing the electric-only range for a plug-in electric hybrid, which is a figure that appears on the certificate of conformity for the vehicle, but not on the V5 and not on the DVLA website. And we've struggled a bit to get lease providers to give us accurate electric-only ranges for plug-in electric hybrids. I've been told it will be better this year, but I've already seen a live example of data provided by a lease provider that wasn't complete for plug-in electric only range. The other one is the RDE2 flag. So if a car is RDE2, then it's taxed like it's a petrol. But if a diesel is an RDE1, then it's obviously subject to the 4% surcharge. And again, we've had some difficulty getting accurate information about RDE1, RDE2, particularly at the point of changeover, where I think there was quite a few vehicles in stock at the time. So, you know, some cars, I know of examples of 5 Series BMWs being delivered where, you know, the early batch were RDE2 and then the second batch were RDE1, because that was the order in which they were delivered. Other issues that clients of ours look at, employees with Grey Fleet, where they're paying mileage reimbursement, but not at the AMAP rate. Employees can claim the difference as tax relief. Some of our clients help the employees do that with business mileage reporting and advice on how to complete P87s. Private fuel is a big one. I mean, private fuel as a benefit has massively declined in the UK. But I think it's like 1 in 6 people with a company car, however, still have it. If you have a petrol or a diesel car, it's almost certainly true that you shouldn't have the private fuel benefit. It's almost certainly true. Obviously, you have to do the maths. There will be exceptions, but for the vast majority of the people, the tax that you pay on the benefit will be more than the value of the fuel that you've received. You have until 6th of July to work that out. And if the benefit of not having private fuel outweighs the value of the private fuel, you can still buy out that benefit as long as you do it by the 6th of July. before you obviously submit the forms P11D showing that there has been no private fuel benefit. Those are the main things from a year-end perspective, but I repeat, we can circle back and answer any questions, but I'm really keen to move on so you can see John's wallpaper.
Thanks very much indeed, Harvey. Okay, over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Julia. Thanks, Harvey. And for the first time, I've been made aware that my shirt actually clashes with my wallpaper, so I do apologise for that if that's causing you some eye confusion. So Harvey's taken you through the numbers for salary sacrifice, and they really are as compelling as Harvey says. And when you're talking to whoever your salary sacrifice partner is, those numbers sort of sell themselves in a sort of no-brainer type way. But Harvey mentioned a few things that could be potential pitfalls around putting together a properly implemented salary sacrifice scheme. And if these aren't covered properly between you and your salary sacrifice partner, they could cause you issues. They are not reasons to avoid a salary sacrifice scheme, but they all need to be covered off so that you're going into this and your employees are going into this with your and their eyes open. So next slide, please, James. So these are some of the softer things where if the numbers stack up, let's have a look at some of the things you need to look at as employers when you are putting together a salary sacrifice scheme. And the first thing is really to get hold of your internal stakeholders. Don't go into this, if you're the person responsible for fleet, whether you're a traditional fleet manager or whether you are in a facilities team, an HR or finance team, other departments in your business will need to be involved in this. And Harvey mentioned a couple of these. The payroll department is absolutely critical to the successful administration of a salary sacrifice scheme. You are affecting people's salaries. You are taking money from their individual pay packets as an employer. So therefore, payroll need to have a smooth process, and you're going to need to involve them. Going through this without involving finance or payroll or HR will lead to potential issues. And I've put facilities in there just to have a think about this. If you're introducing electric vehicles into your employees, then it may well be a consideration for you to put some charging infrastructure in your premises. Now, to do that without talking to your facilities department is going to cause you some issues. I could throw in a couple of other stakeholders in there. If you are heavily unionized, I would involve the unions in this. So it's really for you to think about who your stakeholders need to be, and I would expect that to appear in the implementation plan from any salary sacrifice provider so that your hand is held to go through this. You might want to have a think about the eligibility criteria. I've seen examples from my clients where you may not offer the salary sacrifice scheme to anybody who is new into the business. You know, there may be a period of 3 to 6 months of employment before you allow someone in. I've also seen clients who allow everybody in because, let's be honest, how many people are going to have a car delivered in 3 months given current restrictions? So it may well not be the risk that you think it might be, but have a think about it. The one thing you do need to be very, very careful of is that you cannot sacrifice an employee's salary below national minimum wage. It's just something you cannot do. It's the one roadblock. So that might influence some of the eligibility of your employee population. If you have a lower paid element to your workforce, then it may well be that they can't enter into the scheme because a sacrifice of the car would bring them down below national minimum wage, or it could be that you are thinking about restricting the cars that are available. So somebody on a lower wage can't have a Porsche Taycan, for instance, but they could have a Renault Zoe. You could restrict the number of cars that you offer to people. So you can't have 3 Skoda Enyaqs because the deduction from your salary for these, for you, your partner, your child, could take you below the national minimum wage as a driver. So have a think about how you're going to adapt the eligibility to your scheme. One that doesn't get covered off too much is the credit line that's put in place. As Harvey's mentioned, these are business leases. The financial relationship, the lease, is between the funder and the employer, you, not the individual. So therefore, the credit line is placed on the company, not the individual. If you have restrictions in the amount of credit you are allowed as a business, maybe you're not as financially strong as you wanted to be, do you want to use up some of that valuable credit line for an employee benefit, fantastic as it may be, but then you haven't got enough credit left to order the vans that you need to run your business? Or you order 20, 50, 80 electric vehicles on salary sacrifice, and then the CFO comes on for his company car and there's no credit left. You may want to have a think about whether you're strong enough from a credit covenant perspective to offer this employee benefit. Harvey mentioned motor insurance, and it is typical that a salary sacrifice scheme includes fully comprehensive motor insurance, which is fantastic from a tax efficiency perspective because it goes through the inherent tax benefits that Harvey took you through. But it also, as Harvey also mentioned, covers the grey fleet element of you're providing cars to your employees and you know that they are properly insured. You may well flirt with the idea of using your own fleet insurance. These are company cars, as Harvey mentioned. So technically, you could use your own fleet insurance, but I would advise caution for a couple of reasons for that. If you're using your existing fleet insurance policy for a population that has typically not been company car drivers, maybe it's your cash takers, maybe it's all other employees, you're introducing a new basket of risk to your fleet policy. And maybe your fleet insurance premium could be increased as a result. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is you're introducing, and I would agree with Harvey on this, most of my clients that introduce these schemes are really only doing it for electric vehicles and less so plug-in hybrids. So you're introducing electric vehicles into the fleet premium and adjusting the risk profile for your insurer and your broker. And that may adjust that too. You can look at it, but actually the vast majority of salary sacrifice providers out there are offering an insurance inclusive product, and that is tending to dominate the market. So I would tend to look towards that as the first option, bearing in mind, of course, that the employee is effectively taking on all of these costs through the amount of salary that they're sacrificing. Harvey also mentioned employers' national insurance savings. Do you keep them? Do you share them? It's your choice. I would agree with Harvey that I see a lot of clients passing at least some of these savings onto the employees, but you don't have to. It probably depends on your appetite for risk as an employer, because I'm going to come on to the $6 million or $64 million question about what happens if somebody leaves in a minute. So do you want to keep some of those national insurance savings as a risk provision pot? Do you want to maximize the benefit to your employees and are happy to take the inherent risk financially to you as a business? Your call. There's no right or wrong answer. And it probably depends on who dominates your stakeholder agreements, because a finance director would probably want to keep it all. An HR director would probably want to give it all and enhance the benefit to the employees. And there'll be probably somewhere in between that works for you as a business. But there's no, salary sacrifice doesn't insist that you pass it all on, and it doesn't insist that you keep it all. It's your call. And you can change that down the line if you like. I do have one client who, for the first year of the scheme, decided to give all of the NIC savings, their employer's NIC savings, to the employees to give the scheme a really fast start. And then they were going to review the position after 12 months. So anybody in the scheme would retain that benefit. Anybody new into the scheme, there'll be a decision made in 12 months' time. So you've got flexibility there. Next slide, please, James. So when you're implementing a salary sacrifice scheme, in my experience, 80% of the time spent on that implementation is dealing with one question, which is what happens if somebody leaves? What's the financial risk, early termination, if somebody leaves and puts the keys back on your desk and you have to early terminate that car? You don't have to early terminate the car, of course. You could reallocate the car internally into a company car. You could set up a new salary sacrifice arrangement with a new employee if you wanted. But you'd want to have a well thought through strategy for managing the financial risk with somebody leaving. And that could be resignation, it could be redundancy, it could be ill health, mental or physical, it could be death in service, it could be retirement. And you may have different solutions for each of those. You may have an extensive risk protection element, call it early termination insurance if you like, built in to your salary sacrifice scheme. But again, you don't have to. Depends on your appetite for risk. But really, through the implementation, you need to make sure that you are well covered if you think you need to be to look at early terminations. And you can probably work out what the risks might be there. I do have clients who simply use their employer's NIC savings as a provision pot for those. They've done the sums. They think they may only get, I don't know, 10 early terminations a year. They can work out what a typical early termination might look like. That gives you a sum to provide against. Does the NIC saving cover it? If not, do you need additional protection? So with your salary sacrifice partner, you can work through what your approach needs to be to that. Again, no right or wrong answer on that. The one that sometimes gets missed from some salary sacrifice providers is the risk to you as an employer for somebody going on parental leave. Typically maternity leave, but it doesn't need to be. But there are contractual benefits that the employee must retain when they go on parental leave. So here we're changing the terms and conditions of employment for that individual, and that individual is therefore contractually entitled to keep their benefit, their car, during the period of parental leave. But their salary may drop through that period, but the leasing company still requires you as the employer to pay the same amount to them. You could be left with a gap there that you need to fill. You can't bring the car back from the individual. So you've got to make sure that your provision pot, whether it is your saved national insurance or whether it is any additional insurance product, covers potential risk around parental leave. Now, the next two I'll cover together really. And these are just questions that get asked of a salary sacrifice provider when a scheme goes in. What's the impact on pensions to your employees when you are reducing people's salaries? Now, I'm no qualified pensions advisor. It is likely that your salary sacrifice partner is also not a qualified pensions advisor. So really, the importance here is to make sure that the discussion around pensions is placed in the implementation plan so that you as the employer go to your appropriate stakeholder internally and take the appropriate qualified pensions advice. There is no, so I'm not qualified, and your salary sacrifice partner is probably not qualified to give you accurate pensions advice, but you need to take accurate qualified pensions advice. Likewise, ability to obtain a mortgage. Again, I'm not a qualified mortgage advisor. I understand a mortgage provider might look at affordability, and there's a strong argument to say that a salary sacrifice scheme will improve somebody's affordability. But for a robust implementation, I would suggest that your drivers take qualified mortgage advice before they enter into a salary sacrifice scheme if they are in the market for a mortgage. So you're just going into these things with your eyes open rather than getting caught out with them after the event. Harvey mentioned driver incurred charges, and I've put 3 down here. So what happens if the vehicle comes back damaged? What happens if there's excess mileage on the car? These are classic charges that a leasing company deals with all day long, really. So how do they work in a salary sacrifice scheme? Well, typically, these are included within the agreement that you enter into with your employee to say that if you damage the car, or if you come back with excess mileage, or if you incur a parking or speeding fine, these fines will typically be taken from the employee via the employer. There's no financial relationship between the leasing company and the employee, so it's all directed through the employee. Through the employer. The interesting one is when you address these costs. So let's take excess mileage, for instance. If an employee is traveling over mileage in their contract, I would expect the salary sacrifice partner to advise the leaseco and the employer and the employee that they are heading towards an excess mileage charge. And I would expect them to give them the opportunity to redress that within the period of the salary sacrifice, so that they can then pay the greater amount. Let's say they need to reschedule the agreement from 60,000 to 70,000 miles contract. Then that increased amount can be taken through the inherent tax efficiency of the salary sacrifice scheme. If you leave it until the end of the agreement and there's a £1,000 excess mileage charge or a £1,000 damage charge, and you leave it until the salary sacrifice agreement has ended, those charges are going to get taken from the employee's net salary. Nowhere near as tax efficient as doing it through salary sacrifice. So I would urge caution to make sure that your salary sacrifice partner has the opportunity to try and address these, first of all, mid-contract, but also through the efficiency of salary sacrifice rather than waiting till the end. You could have the most amazing salary sacrifice scheme in the world, but if your employees don't know about it, there's no point. So how are you going to engage your employees? Again, your salary sacrifice partner should come to you with ideas on this, but you will know how to present employee benefits. Let's say you launch an amazing cycle to work scheme or an amazing whatever you have as employee benefits. How do you market to them? Do you have webinars? Do you have an intranet? Do you have an employee benefits partner? However you get the message across, this will need to form part of your salary sacrifice implementation. And equally as importantly, the need to educate your employees, because you could have, again, the most amazing salary sacrifice scheme in the world. Harvey's taken you through the numbers. They are absolutely compelling. But if your employee base is nervous about electric vehicles, range anxiety, charging anxiety, the battery won't last, the grid won't cope if everybody, all of those myths that are out there around electric vehicles, nobody's going to take up your scheme if they don't like electric vehicles. So what's your plan to educate the employees into getting comfortable with the general concept of electric vehicles? That's going to be a really important one to make sure that your employee engagement, your scheme take-up rate is maximized, because if everybody's nervous of electric vehicles and you've done nothing about that, don't expect many people to come through your salary sacrifice scheme. But that's easily addressed with education. Next slide, please, James. So final slide from me. What should you expect from whoever you go into bed with your salary sacrifice scheme? Well, Harvey mentioned the agreement that the employee enters into. They're entering into a change in their terms and conditions, reducing their salary and taking a benefit in kind instead of their salary. So there needs to be a formal agreement to do that. And typically that agreement is provided by the salary sacrifice partner. It may be in template form, but the reason I say this is I'm aware of certain smaller providers who are sort of trying to jump on the salary sacrifice bandwagon, who are providing a contract hire quote to their customer. And I kid you not, all they're doing to accompany that is they are providing a link to a Google site about how to do salary sacrifice. That to me is not a robust salary sacrifice scheme. So these are the things I would expect out of a salary sacrifice provider. They'll provide you with the relevant scheme documents to set the scheme running. They will have options around protection against early termination, your financial risk against early termination. They will talk you through that as if whether you need it or not, whether you want it or not, but they should have the flexibility to include an element of early termination protection in their scheme so that you are reassured that you're not financially exposed. They're going to need to have a quoting portal. The contract hire rental is irrelevant to the employee. That's not what they're paying. What they need to see is the impact on their gross salary and the impact on their net salary by entering into the salary sacrifice scheme. So showing an employee a monthly rental or an insurance premium is frankly irrelevant. The partner needs to show gross impact and net impact on salary. And if we've decided that it's better and advisable to have an insurance inclusive proposition, of course, your salary sacrifice partner needs to have a robust motor insurance proposition with the relevant criteria. So what's the excess going to be? How many people are you going to have insured? Is it the driver plus one? Is it the driver plus two? Are there additional excesses for younger drivers with 6 or 9 points on their license? But I would expect that to be included with your salary sacrifice partner. And I would expect them to have a track record in implementing these schemes so that they can take you through all of this. I can't expect an employer to know all of the things they need to know about a salary sacrifice scheme, but I would expect your partner to hold your hand there. And Harvey mentioned the importance of guiding the payroll team. So I would expect support for the internal stakeholders, payroll guidance, FAQ specifically for the payroll team. This is exactly what you need to do. Payroll teams, and Harvey is an expert in this, payroll teams like to be told what to do, exactly how much money to take and at what time. So your salary sacrifice partner needs to work very closely with the payroll team in your company. They'll also need to work with your internal marketing team, with your internal comms team, to make sure that the scheme is put together well, marketed well, and fully understood. both from a salary sacrifice perspective, how does it work? And from an electric vehicle perspective, how can I get comfortable about electric vehicles? So there's a few things from me on how to manage an effective implementation through salary sacrifice and make those numbers that Harvey mentioned really come to life.
That's fabulous. Thank you very much, John. Very informative. I'd now like to start the Q&A session. Paul Hollick, our AFP chair, is going to be joining the panel now. We've had a number of questions already. Start at the top. This is from Lee. With insurance and risk mitigation on salary sacrifice, could we use 50% of the NI for a risk pot for any ULR? John?
Simple answer is yes. You can do what you like with your saved NI. You can use some of it, all of it, none of it, and it will depend on what you are offered from your salary sacrifice partner, because if your salary sacrifice partner offers a scheme that protects you to within an inch of your life from any financial exposure, you may decide you don't need to use your saved NI to use that because it's protected elsewhere. And that's where you may choose to share some of the NI savings with the employees. But in simple answer to the question, Lee, yes, you can use 50%, some of it, all of it, or none of it to make a provision pot for that.
Okay, fabulous.
Sorry, John, is just adding to that, is it possible for the employer, in your opinion, to add to the rentals anyway, to create a contingency pot to cover?
I've seen it happen. If we take the broad concept of a provision pot, it's really a case of who holds that pot. So you could have, let's say the amount for the rental of the car, including insurance, including maintenance, including non-recoverable VAT, everything that the employer is liable for. Let's say it's £500. There's nothing stopping the employer. Normally, the gross salary sacrifice amount would be £500 so that the employer's face is washed. But there's nothing stopping the employer taking £550 out from the employee and building up an additional provision pot for them to use for any financial exposure. By the same token, there's nothing stopping the salary sacrifice partner charging £550 instead of £500 and including an element of early termination protection, insurance, call it what you like. Although I'd advise caution about the word insurance from an FCA provision perspective. Some people, they deliberately avoid the word insurance in here, but that's kind of what we're talking about. But yeah, the provision pot, it could be held by the provider. It could be held by the employer. And the important point to remember here is if the pot is not used up, if there's a surplus, then if it's your partner that's holding the pot, they'll probably keep the surplus. If it's you as the employer holding the pot, you can use the surplus. But yeah, the concept of building up an additional provision, absolutely.
Harvey, do you mind if I add?
Yeah.
I think that there's a couple of things here to be really, really careful of. The first thing is that the massive tax and national insurance savings, it goes without saying. So that's why John and I keep saying it. But you can make this too expensive for the employee. Certainly if you look at salary sacrifice, 15 years ago when we first started doing this with diesel cars, you could make the sacrifice too expensive because you put too much in there. So you bought very expensive insurance, you had a provision. There's a whole bunch of things you might do in order to reduce your risk, but each time you increase the cost to the employee, then you make the scheme less attractive to the employee. That will translate into take-up rates, and that will then mean that you won't see the NIC savings you were expecting to see. So it's important, I think, firstly, to find a vendor who's going to give you a decent rental for the vehicles, because the employees don't pay the rental, they pay the salary sacrifice, but it's calculated based upon the true cost to the employer, and the employer is paying the rental. So I do worry that there's a lot of money here. There's a lot of tax and national insurance savings. And it may well be that providers are looking at this and saying, this is an opportunity for us to make more of a margin. And it's very important through the selection of your funder to find someone who's going to fund these vehicles at a cost-effective rate, because that will affect the sacrifice to the employee. And it also gives you more margin to build things in. So to Paul's comment, yes, you can add an admin charge or a provision. We call it a provision. But you've sort of got three interrelated things, because you've got the early termination insurance, and there are different flavors of that. So you can pay more to get more, pay less to get less. You've got the admin fee, and then you've got the NIC saving. And when we have our kickoff meetings with our clients where we're setting these schemes up for them, I put those three things into one slide. Say your decision in one box is going to affect your decision in the other. As a rule, if the employer is keeping all or a large proportion of the NIC saving, then I would suggest that that's enough money to protect you from a rainy day, particularly if it's met with early termination insurance. But always with that view of, are we keeping these overall costs to the employees at an attractive level to generate the take up that we want to see?
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Jim Blair. If a driver is already entitled to choose an electric company car, is salary sacrifice that attractive? Is that one for you, Harvey, to kick off on?
They are not in the same space. If you've got a company car, then you're funding it. So you as an employer, give an employer a company car, you're paying for that company car. If you convert that person to cash, then you're paying for the cash. The point to salary sacrifice is that from the employer's perspective, it's a free car because the employee is paying for it by way of the sacrifice. So what we see, for instance, is we see scenarios where people have had a traditional diesel company car. They opt into cash. So obviously you need to make sure that cash is an appropriate amount given what the car was costing you as a company car. I'm talking about it from the employer's perspective. And then they sacrifice that cash in order to get an EV, which is a bit convoluted, but it makes sense given the way that some of these schemes are designed. So for me, it's about entitlement. And if that entitlement is expressed as a car, then you've already got a car, just get an EV and you'll get all of these benefits. If that entitlement is expressed as cash, well, you can sacrifice that cash and get an EV. So the entitlement is separate from the salary sacrifice. The other thing you do see is you see people who've got an electric company car who take salary sacrifice for a second car, maybe for their spouse. So they now have two company cars, but one of them is funded by the employer because it's an entitlement. The other one is funded by the employee because there's a salary sacrifice. I hope that makes sense.
I have, just to add, I have seen some businesses effectively move their entire business into two pots of salary sacrifice. One is the company car eligible employees, where effectively they get notional cash. They then provide a scheme that provides different level of insurance, because of course motor insurance, etc., can be done differently for that population of company car drivers. And then you end up with a full-blown salary sacrifice scheme for the non-company car eligible employees. And second cars and things like that as well. So they end up with two schemes run in a similar way, but the insurances are slightly different in terms of the way that they're offered.
Yeah, and I've seen similar things where, and it's typically with much larger organisations who have thousands of company cars. I have seen a couple of companies do away with their company car scheme and replace it with a salary sacrifice scheme and offer the salary sacrifice scheme to everybody. To Harvey's point, I don't think there's a huge financial advantage for the company car eligible element. Much better to stick them just in a company car, electric. But they've done it for administration reasons rather than having a company car scheme over here and a salary sacrifice scheme over here. They were too big and it was too administratively burdensome. So they rolled everybody into the same scheme, mindful of the fact that there wouldn't be a major benefit for the company car drivers. But yeah, I take your point, Paul, to have the two separate pots for insurance purposes.
Well, you've got to remember, sorry, Harvey, you've got to remember that salary sacrifice schemes are really offering a contract hire vehicle, a company car with some insurances on it to cover the risk for those employees that you don't have any real understanding with in terms of how they drive, where they drive, what types of, where they store their vehicle, how to insure those vehicles as well. So effectively salary sacrifice is just contract hire with insurances on top.
Yes.
The other thing that's interesting, and this goes back to the root of things like flexible benefits, is if you give an employee a fixed amount of money and then let them have whatever car they want by way of salary sacrifice, you've taken out that blank check element you get with a company car. With entitlement schemes, with traditional company car schemes, you give someone a car, they don't look after it, they do many, many more miles than you'd anticipated they'd done in it, and there's no comeback on that. where traditionally there isn't a comeback on that. Whereas with a salary sacrifice scheme, the entire cost of the contract is met by the employee by way of salary sacrifice. So the car they drive becomes a function of their willingness to spend money. If they mistreat the car or they do more miles in the car, it costs them more money, not the employer. So there's a transfer of risk implicit in a salary sacrifice arrangement, and that makes it quite attractive to HR. We've seen similar things, where, organizations say everyone's going to have married Bupa and we'll just pay for that. And the cost of Bupa just goes up and up and up. But for a flex scheme, what you do is you allocate them a budget and then you allow them to opt into Bupa. So you've just transferred the cost of those annual increases from employer to employee. It's the same sort of thing. You're making the employee pay for the change in cost.
Okay, that's great. Next question. It's quite an interesting one. How do you control drivers from, or dissuade them from underestimating their annual mileage to take advantage of a cheaper rental? John?
Hi, David, by the way, good to see you. I suppose there's two things to bear in mind here. First of all, the driver doesn't see the rental. They see the impact on their salary, but also I would expect to have something in the salary sacrifice agreement, the change to the terms and conditions that gives the employer the ability, in David's words there, to enforce recontract. So if somebody is going to do a 10,000 mile a year contract, knowing they're doing 40,000 miles a year, I would expect the employer, it's going to be in the contract between the funder and the employer. So I would expect some provision between the employer and the employee to say, if you swing the lead on this, we will take the money out of your salary mid-contract, not at the end of contract. So I would expect, to answer your question shortly, briefly, David, can you enforce recontract? I think it can be in the employee-employer terms and conditions.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah,
Harvey, would you like to mention that?
Please, just to add to that, sorry, I was on mute. I mean, certainly the portal that we've developed, if you change your mileage, you can see the salary sacrifice change immediately. I think that's pretty standard functionality. So, from an employee's perspective, yeah, set it to 5,000. You're going to save a fortune, but all you're going to do is generate an excess mileage charge. So if there's a recontract, and it doesn't follow, by the way, that the sacrifice automatically changes, that's a little bit more complicated than that, although it certainly could change. But whatever happens, the liability is the liability of the employee, whether it's a liability to a change in net deduction, whether it's a liability to a change in salary sacrifice, or whether it's an excess mileage at the end. It's the employee's liability, not the employer's liability. And you just need to make it really, really clear to them up front that that's the case.
Yeah.
Okay.
What you wouldn't want, though, Harvey, is the employer to have a big excess mileage charge at the end of the ride, though, without them being aware. So that would need to be managed by the fleet manager, wouldn't it?
Totally agree. And all of that is flagged as a matter of course. So obviously every time, state the obvious, but every time the car gets serviced, we capture the mileage, that information is shared. And LeaseCo will, as a matter of course, say to the employer, look, the rental is not high enough to cover this cost. We'd like to increase the rental. My point is how that liability for that increase translates into a cost to the employee. And if for some reason it doesn't get picked up and it becomes an excess mileage charge, that's still a net liability of the employee. Worst case scenario is they hand the car back and then leave before you're able to recover the excess mileage charge from them. And that's one of the reasons, it's one of a series of reasons why I think it's important to have a provision or to retain that NIC saving, because there's going to be rainy days. You can plan for it to be nice and sunny, but there's going to be rainy days. We live in England.
I'd agree.
Yeah. Emma is asking whether a salary sacrifice scheme is applicable only to those that drive on business, or can it be open to all employees regardless of whether they drive for work or undertake business mileage?
I would say it should be offered out to the whole employee base as an employee benefit, mindful of certain eligibility criteria, as I mentioned, but no, it's certainly not just for people that drive on business. If we're talking about some of the wider, more environmental benefits, if we are looking at a salary sacrifice scheme to help an employer move towards their net zero aspirations, then the more of your employee base you can get into electric cars, whether they drive business mileage or not, they will count towards Scope 3 emissions in the in the net zero in the carbon footprint calculation of a business. So I would say no, it should be offered out as an employee benefit. Yes, cash takers will benefit hugely from this. You can offer it to company car drivers, as Harvey said, maybe take an additional car under the salary sacrifice scheme for a partner. But I would say offer it to all staff, mindful of restrictions, national minimum wage being one example, but it's an employee benefit rather than a replacement to a company car scheme.
Okay. We have another question from Emma. For employees that don't undertake business mileage but take up the salary sacrifice scheme, what is the duty of care requirements of the employer other than licence verification? Is that another one for you, John?
Yeah, I'll happily take that on. I guess if they're not undertaking business mileage, it is a car provided by the employer. If they're not doing business mileage, the duty of care element is somewhat diluted, but as a responsible employer, I would still want to make sure that any car I am providing to any of my employees as a benefit is safe and legal to be on the road. I would also probably want to check that they are safe and legal to be on the road, and that's where a license check comes in. And I think it's valid potentially to include a, inverted commas, free license check in the salary sacrifice arrangement. Of course, that washes through to the employee paying for it ultimately. You could go a step further actually, and you could include, and this will be right up your street, Emma, but you could include some form of EV familiarization training as well in the salary sacrifice arrangement. If I'm putting my employees in electric cars, business mileage or otherwise, I think I've got a duty of care to make sure they know how to drive them safely and efficiently. Do they know that they're a safety risk when they're reversing silently, or regenerative braking, or instant power underneath your right foot? So I think you can put all of those things in a salary sacrifice arrangement. It's not necessarily around business mileage. It's about being a responsible employer and putting people in electric cars. So yes, I think you can include those, and there is a duty of care even if you don't drive business miles.
I think as well, you know, the great thing about salary sacrifice is you move an employee from a potentially older vehicle into a brand new vehicle. The salary sacrifice arrangements include service, maintenance and repair, like you would get on a normal company car, so you know that the vehicle is going to be serviced and maintained properly. And it includes insurance, which includes business cover as well. So the main risk there is for sure making sure that the driver's got a valid license.
Yep.
But again, most of the operators, John, and I'm sure you agree, would ask for the license details anyway, because
yes,
that when they're insuring, they are looking at that license information to see whether they've got 6 points or more. And
yes,
then
absolutely.
that impacts the insurance premiums that the people pay on a salary sacrifice scheme.
Yeah.
And I also agree with John, you know, that there is still the overall occupational road risk requirements and your duty of care that you've got on your employee, because they are in a company asset. It is a company asset, even if they're not traveling on business trips. So it's still, you still need to make sure that the vehicle is being MOT'd and taxed in the right way, but it will be because it's a company car.
And it will be. And if you're not addressing the safety in the car element, you do run the risk of your insurance premiums rocketing in year 2, year 3, etc. So there is a duty of care, but there's also some very valid reasons why wouldn't you, in trying to minimize the risk of putting your employees in these cars, because if you don't, there's the inherent safety risk to the drivers and anybody else on the roads, but there's also the financial impact of this as well.
Totally.
Okay, we have another question for you, John, from Gareth Owens. In relation to cars, not vans, how do telematics fit in with the salary sacrifice scheme?
The irony is not lost that I'm taking on a telematics question with Paul in his new role. I might pass this one over to you. I might pass this one over to you in a minute, Paul. My answer to that would be, it depends what you're using the telematics for. Are you using the telematics for driver behavior purposes? Are you using it for mileage capture purposes? You can have telematics fitted into cars, but I think there's a cultural thing here to make sure that the drivers understand why there are telematics in cars and what are you looking to achieve, and is there a big brother element in a car? So yes, I think you can have telematics in the cars. I don't see it that often, if I'm honest. I mean, I'll bow to Paul's greater judgment on this. But I think, how do telematics fit in with salary sacrifice cars? You can have them if you want them. I would expect some employees to be a little nervous about having telematics in a car unless you have completely covered off with them culturally why it's there. So why are you putting a telematic system in the car? Is it to protect the employee? Is it to keep an eye on them? Is it to track mileage? So many uses for telematics, but I think it's technically possible. I'd just make sure you know why you're doing it and convey that clearly to the employee base. Paul,
Yeah.
you're the telematics.
My view of this marketplace is that, you know, there's a high percentage of personal use on salary sacrifice vehicles.
Yes.
Telematics doesn't really fit that well unless it's insurance-based telemetry systems and you're putting in telematics in to try and reduce the insurance premiums to the employees so they pay less insurance per month through their package because of the telemetry systems they've got in place. And my view as well is that the employee needs to be up for it. So they need to see a benefit out of this if you are offering telematics and salary sacrifice schemes. So the only benefit is that they'll pay a lower premium or a lower rental if you put the telematics system in. My view is that most employees will say, actually, I don't want telematics in my salary sacrifice vehicle, and it might actually reduce the uptake rate, because if you force them to, then they'll probably not bother because they'd rather not do that. So you need to be really careful with telematics in this segment, I think. And my view is, a bit like John said, is if there's a benefit for the driver, you could offer it as an optional extra, but as a vanilla product, I wouldn't probably put it into a scheme.
Which might address David Bushnell's question.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah, so that's answered that question. We have another one from Chris Lampert. How can we include the cost of a home charger and spread the cost over the term? John, is that one for you?
Yeah, I'll happily take it on. Yeah, you can. I've seen it done. I see people include the cost of home chargers in there, bearing in mind the grant is going to be taken away for homeowners in April anyway. So these are going to be costing the thick end of £1,000. A couple of things to bear in mind. First of all, I think it needs to be optional, because there's a fair chunk of drivers who can't charge at home because they live on terraced houses, flats, etc. So that benefit is of no use to them whatsoever. So I think it's got to be an optional thing, a bit like an extra, bit like metallic paint or alloy wheels. The other thing to bear in mind on this is the home charger has a different useful life than the car. So it's not as if you hand the charger back with the car after 3 years or 4 years. So how is that going to be? Is it going to be depreciated over the 3 years? Is it going to be depreciated over 1 year? What happens if the employee leaves? They hand the car back. Are you going to rip the charger off their wall? Unlikely. Are you going to have something in the employee agreement, the terms and conditions, to say, if you leave and you've taken a charger off us, we will recover all remaining costs from you? So technically it can be done. You just need to think about what happens, in Harvey's words, what happens on the rainy days? What happens if somebody leaves? How are you going to deal with that? Are you going to be a nice employer and just let them have it? But if they've left 6 weeks after they've joined the scheme, that feels like they've probably taken you for a ride a little bit. So yes, you can do it technically. It's tax efficient to do so, but there are some issues to be mindful of if you're doing that. Harvey, from a tax perspective, there's no issue with it, is it? It's just don't get caught out by the rainy days.
I agree. I also think, when you look at some of the other costs associated with providing a car by salary sacrifice, it's not actually that big a number. You could, say £1,000, but you divide it by 36 when you bear in mind, for instance, what the insurance on some of these cars costs, what the insurance on the Tesla 3. When I first saw the insurance quote on the Tesla 3, I fell off my chair.
Yeah, they're not. Teslas aren't that well liked by the insurance population. I think it comes down to calling one of their cars performance mode or ludicrous mode. It's.
Another question for you, Harvey. How long does it take from start to finish to launch a salary sacrifice scheme?
Well, this is interesting, actually, because I think this is very much a question for me and John, because we're both busy doing just that. I've seen it done in a couple of weeks. I think it depends upon the size of the organization and the will in the organization. Usually there's a finance director or an HR director in there who's absolutely desperate to order a car. That tends to drive the process forward.
Exactly, yeah.
And in a small organization with that sort of mindset, I've seen it done in a couple to 3 weeks, assuming they've already decided on their vendor. The vendor selection process can take a time. But when clients ask me, I usually say 2 to 3 months, just to be safe.
John?
Yeah, do you know what I've just written down here 8 to 12 weeks, which is kind of almost exactly what Harvey just said. Doing it in 2 weeks, I'm thinking, whoa, there's a lot of stuff to cover here. But it does depend on the appetite of the stakeholders, and as Harvey said, it's normally driven by a stakeholder who wants their Porsche Taycan. But I would say 8 to 12 weeks you can deliver a well implemented scheme in 8 to 12 weeks. It's the legals that tend to, as with any contract negotiation, it tends to be the legals that get in the way, because all the stakeholders could be right up for this, but I would imagine the employer's legal department will need to get involved to negotiate the master agreement and possibly the change to terms and conditions, and legal teams tend to slow the process down. Unfortunately, we all get on well with our legal colleagues, but it is normally the bottleneck for this.
Okay.
Unless it's the head of legal that needs his Porsche Taycan.
An interesting question here. The Laing-O'Rourke case and the Wilmot-Dixon case had different verdicts. Why was this?
Oh, wow. Okay, that one came from the bottom of the pack.
And straight to you, Harvey.
Yeah. It all comes down, I think, to the specifics of the circumstances of each case, because there's actually been 3 cases, because we started out with Total People. So Total People was a while ago now. That was won by the taxpayer. The revenue disputed the result. And then we saw Laing-O'Rourke, which was lost by the taxpayer, but there's a question mark over whether that will be appealed. And there may be others on the phone who know better about than I do as to whether that's gone to appeal. And then we've got Wilmot-Dixon, where the taxpayer won, but I understand, again, there's a question mark over whether that will go to appeal. Each of these cases sort of swings on the evidence. So the issue is, can you take a cash allowance that you've paid an employee, and after the event say, actually, it was irrelevant motoring expenses, and therefore we should be able to recover the NIC on the basis of 45p a mile? In the same way that employees can with the income tax, where the treatment is different. And it all comes down to what was said to the employees at the time, how you've described that allowance when you paid it to the employees, and what evidence you have to support the business mileage the employees did and the costs that the employees incurred. And my view is the revenue won't give up on this. I think they will continue to fight this. They don't like it. They'll continue to fight it, and they'll force everyone to go through the courts in order to get their money back. So I think the question for employers, and I could be wrong, it could be that the revenue, they'll turn around and issue new guidance, and we start seeing open season on recovering these NIC amounts in previous years. But my sense, without having a crystal ball, is that the revenue will keep fighting, and that it will just be difficult for each employer to recover their NIC, and each employer will have to be able to demonstrate, potentially in the courts, that their particular set of circumstance lends itself to reclaim. Anything to add to that, Paul?
No, I completely agree. I think that, for fleet managers and fleets out there, we just need to recognise at the moment there are options anyway out there in the marketplace, not to go retrospectively, but to still optimise your cash payment to save NIC on a monthly basis. So there are providers out there anyway. So the Laing-O'Rourke and Wilmot-Dixon cases is going back 7 years worth of AMAPs, but it is possible at the moment to launch schemes in the UK where if you are paying an employee 10 to 15 pence per mile, they can claim obviously full AMAP. There's a gap there. They can either claim on a P87 at the end of the tax year, or you can put it through payroll and then the employer saves a load of NI as well. And that method is probably better if you've got an awful lot of cash allowance drivers. Now, obviously, what we are seeing though, and the reason for this webinar, is a lot of those cash drivers are coming back into company cars anyway. So you just need to just recognise whether it's worth it or not at the moment based on the way that the car park's working out.
What it does undermine for me, and I've just written an article on this, and if it gets approved, I'll publish it. But I just keep coming back to, why is everything so complicated? So for instance, you can get the tax back, but you can't get the NIC back because NIC has its own set of rules. Now, I know I get paid to deal with these issues, and therefore it's very much in our interest, HRUX's interest, for it to be complicated. But does it really need to be this complicated? Every single issue has so many wrinkles. And even something as simple as salary sacrifice, there are some fairly major questions you need to take very, very seriously before you implement one of these arrangements, as we've been talking about for the last hour.
Yeah.
Totally agree. It's not for the faint-hearted, is it? But that's the reason why I get paid the big bucks, Harvey, you see.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay, one final question. This is again this is from Julie Larkman. She's asking if the home charger is included and is fully amortized over the 3 years, does this change the agreement into a regulated one? That's an interesting question.
Sounds like one for you, Harvey. Hi, Julie, by the way.
Is it regulated by the FCA, that is?
Yeah.
Yeah, but the charger is provided by the employer. The employer is acquiring the charger. Doesn't matter how the employer pays for it, over what time period the employer pays for it. This question is about how much they choose to recover via the salary sacrifice, and whether or not they have a separate tax charge in respect of that charger, for which the answer, as John has already said, is that they shouldn't. So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I think the answer is no, it's not regulated, because an employer, regardless of whether it is or isn't a loan to the employee for that money, the employer can still loan an employee up to £10,000 free of tax and NI. So the charger won't cost more than that anyway. So therefore it won't be effectively anything to do. There won't be any interest charges. There won't be anything that needs to be regulated by the FCA. It will all be fine, in my view.
Yeah. Okay. Although I said that last question was the last one, the final one, we have one more, and I think it's a good close. And this is from Matt Neal. And I know you touched upon this, John, in your presentation, but if you could close off by just highlighting the disadvantages, the major disadvantages to consider on salary sacrifice.
Okay, so everything I touched upon from the what could go wrong, if they're not well handled in the implementation, they could all end up as being disadvantages. The one thing I would say in addition to that, which is could be viewed as a disadvantage, but it's a bit of a quid pro quo, because for a disadvantage, look at the benefit you're getting from an employee benefit perspective and an NIC saving perspective. But I would say the one other thing to consider is you are creating an additional fleet here. These are company cars. You are increasing your company car fleet, and that comes with a level of administration for your stakeholders. There is, if you're the fleet manager, I appreciate there aren't too many pure fleet managers around, but you've got more cars to manage. That's more administration. So I would say a disadvantage potentially is the increased administration of running a salary sacrifice scheme. I would lean on my partner to mitigate that administration significantly, and I would also look at the benefits I get in return for that disadvantages. But I would throw in increased administration as a potential disadvantage for a scheme, outweighed by the benefits.
Okay, and Harvey?
Your finance director orders a Porsche Taycan, and then 3 weeks after it arrives, leaves. The termination charge on that vehicle is 50% of outstanding rentals. It's a massively expensive vehicle. You find yourself with a invoice for £30,000, say, and you can't recover that from the individual because you've only got one payment left and you simply can't do it. You can go through the courts, and employers are well versed in going through the courts to recover money from the exiting employees. And of course, it's not covered by your ETI insurance because you haven't had the minimum period between order delivery and the employee resigning. That's the one that worries me most. And I talked earlier on about rainy days, but sometimes it really, really can rain. And that's the one that worries me most, is that you have someone who is duplicitous and leaves too early for your insurance to have bit.
Yeah. Okay, that concludes the Q&A session for this morning. Thank you everybody for their contribution. As mentioned previously, we'll be including the webinar recording into the AFP website so that members can reference it in the future. I'd like to take this opportunity of thanking John and Harvey for their contribution today. And I hope you found this webinar as interesting as I did. But before we close, I've just got some dates and news for you to just cover off. In terms of courses, I mentioned at the last webinar that we were launching a number of courses. We have one in early April in the Midlands in Tamworth on new funding and a finance course. We've got an EV course on the 13th of April for cars and on the 12th of April for vans. We've got a fleet vehicle management strategic course on the 10th of May, but please see the website for a full list of courses. Please continue to reference that. An important announcement is our conference. We have a date, the 18th of May, and that's at the the British Motor Museum. It's a members only event and obviously is free to members, but we'd encourage you to register via the website. There are exhibitor opportunities that we'd welcome again. Contact us through the website. There's a new EV survey live again through the website. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. We'd encourage everybody to do that. We launched the new members area of the website last week. Be interested to see whether you've looked at it and to receive any comments and in ways in which you'd like to see it improved. The Dealer Standard programme was launched this month. Again, see the website for more information. And lastly, please continue to follow us on LinkedIn. We do have regular posts on there, and that will keep you updated with everything that's going on. Next slide. And on the final slide, our next webinar. That's going to launch the dealer standards. It's going to be a mini webinar, but again, look out for more information on that. And if you're currently a member, we'd please, if you're not currently a member, please, come to our website. We'd love to see you. There was a question: how do I get a copy of the presentation and the webinar recording? Well, the answer is to join. So we'd, by all means, we'd look forward to hearing from you and having you as a new member. I think that's it for this morning. Thank you all once again for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.